to, I mean, cool. So Eleanor very kindly invited me to come and speak to you all tonight. So as she's already sort of said, my expertise, I guess, lies in this domain of extreme environment psychology in its kind of broadest sense. We'll discover what that is and what it means throughout the next sort of 30 minutes or so. And there'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end if people want to ask them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what extreme environments are. So I'm assuming people have had a bit of experience in these kinds of settings, but I'm going to set a sort of a baseline understanding of what we mean by extreme environments. I'll then talk a little bit about what the role of, at least from how I see it, what the role of psychology is in those settings, give you a bit of an insight into what colleagues and I have been doing, and there's people on the call that have been involved in some of that, and then where that might take us in the future, or what might happen next with some of that work. So that's the kind of main overview of what we're going to be talking about. Just as a sort of a little bit of a teaser, people sometimes ask, how did you get into this work? For me, this is the place where it all started, the kind of inception point. There's a professor in Canada who's an emeritus professor now, a guy called Peter Sudfeld, and he is the sort of, I guess, the forefather really of a lot of this extreme environment psychology work. So he did a lot of work in the early days on polar psychology, and then translated that into sort of the domain of space. And he wrote this. This isn't an empirical piece of work; it's a narrative study or a narrative paper, which is interspersed with verses out of the poem Invictus, and he called it Homo Invictus, the Indomitable Species. And through this essay, he talks about the capacity for human beings to be resilient, to cope with the most extreme situations and settings that they could ever possibly face. People that came out the other side of the Holocaust, people that have lost loved ones in dreadful accidents and tragic accidents, as well as people that have chosen to go and put themselves through arduous and extremely difficult and demanding tasks. And the general consensus of a lot of this work is that people tend to come out the other side of this okay, or at least they come out in some way changed, but often for the better. They feel stronger. They appreciate life more, and so this notion, this was written quite a long time ago now, but since then there's been lots of work looking at the experiences of trauma and trauma exposure, and the same story holds true. When you track people that have been exposed to very traumatic incidents and events, the majority of people are resilient and tend to meet those challenges and are able to cope and in some cases thrive. So this was really what got me into this domain of work. I read this essay and I was kind of hooked straight away. This was in the middle of doing my PhD studies, so I was getting a bit bored with what I was doing. And so this was a kind of nice stepping off point and a bit of a distraction during that time. And since then, since kind of nearly a decade now, 2014, colleagues and I have been doing lots of work on people in these extreme environments, and that's what I'm going to try and weave together today, and give you a bit of a feel for what that work looks like. So if we start with a classic academic, like a definition, to me, and this is how we frame what extreme environments are. Extreme environments are settings that possess extraordinary physical, psychological, and interpersonal demands that require significant human adaptation for survival, performance, and health. And I've underlined and bolded the word adaptation, because this is really the essence of where psychology fits here, is that when people are exposed to these extreme environments, they need to do something. They need to change how they think, how they feel, how they behave, adapt, in order to, one, survive, but also to perform and stay happy and healthy whilst they're doing so. And when we talk about adaptation, this is about changing the things that we do. So the way we behaved walking down a sunny, warm street in London, compared to being plonked in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, is going to be very different. We need to be able to do things differently. We need to adjust and adapt how we approach that situation in order to do those things: survive, perform, and stay happy and healthy. Now, my work has principally focused on three areas of this. So where extreme environments fit, there's three areas for me. And it's mainly with people that choose extremes, if you like. They choose to either go there for recreational reasons, for expeditions, people walking across deserts or skiing across polar ice caps, rowing oceans, climbing mountains, those sorts of people. The domain of space. So we've done quite a bit of work in both on the ISS, but also in space analog environments, isolation and confinement chambers. And then a large volume of my work is focused on people in operational settings. So defense, security, policing, settings where they can be exposed to extreme environments in the course of their day-to-day jobs and work. So these are the sort of domains that I focus on. Of course, there are lots of other circumstances where people might be exposed to extreme conditions. There might be people affected by climate disasters, people in situations not out of their choosing where they're exposed to extreme environments. And that's quite a different experience. So I'm not going to go too deep into that today, but these are the people that we're interested in typically, the people that actively put themselves in extremes. And when so extreme is a relative phenomenon. So the idea of an extreme environment, if you talk to very experienced people, and there are many of them on this call, what's extreme to people that have been in many of these environments many times is not the same as what's extreme to someone that's been in them for the first time and being exposed to some of those demands, having never been experiencing them before. So extreme is a relative phenomenon. And we kind of, when we try and attribute what's an extreme environment, we think about two things. So we think about the extremeness of the environment, and that means how are those features perceived and evaluated on a, if you think about it on a scale of no, not extreme at all, to 100, the most extreme, then you can start to get an impression of like objectively what's this situation like. And so the picture here of this climber hanging off the side of an ice cliff face, that looks extreme, but it's probably not quite as extreme as that same person being in this situation and hooked up in that avalanche. So there's the extremeness of the situation that person's in. So we look at that relative to the person's experience. And we also are interested in how unusual that environment is. So, microgravity for most people will be a very unusual environment. But when we look at some of the extreme environments on Earth, especially if some of those places are places where people go to regularly or they're inhabited by local populations, then, they won't necessarily be that unusual for people. And, I like this quote from the Batman series. Obviously, Nolan was the sort of person that produced the best Batman films out there, controversial. But this idea of if you've grown up in the dark, then that's not unusual to you. So if you've been raised in an extreme environment, then what's extreme is going to be different to someone that's traveling there, by nature of already having undergone that adaptation process. So we're interested in, when we talk about extreme environments, we're interested in the extremeness and the unusualness of that environment. Now, even if something's not that unusual, it can be extreme. So the person that's lived in cold places all their life, that environment can still become quite extreme when the features are exacerbated. But most unusual environments will have some element of an extreme extremity to it. We talk a little bit about this, so I won't linger too long on this. But if we're interested in reading a little bit more about our thinking behind that, we published a paper a few years ago around what we mean by psychology and extremes. And actually, in this paper, we kind of used what we know about kind of the broad study of people in extremes, and we applied it to CT operations. But it's a really nice, I think, at least from my perspective, it's a really nice way of starting to understand how these two worlds align. And we talk about that extremeness and unusualness issue in the paper. Why is any of that relevant? So the reason for highlighting that and the reason for giving you a definition of an extreme environment is that when the demands of those environments, so the intensity of those demands and how unusual those demands are, when those demands approach or exceed our resources, whether they're physical or psychological or social resources, when the demands outweigh those resources, then we're likely to feel a sense of stress. And stress is a psychophysiological response. caused by some stresses and demands. So it's that load that's added to the human, which then kind of creates this stress response. Now, stress gets a bad rep, but it is a normal and necessary response. We wouldn't have it if it didn't serve a purpose. So the idea of being stressed is, in many cases, activating, focuses our attention, makes us react to a situation that might be threatening and causes harm. But in extreme environments, how we respond to those stress responses will dictate whether we perform well, whether we stay safe, and whether we are kind of ultimately feeling happy about what we're doing. So mitigating and managing that stress is really important. Stress also takes on multiple forms. So the point of showing you this is, so if we think about in an emergency response situation, bang, the buzzer goes, the adrenaline starts to flood into the body. So it's a little bit like the hammer hitting the meter and the meter flying up. We get that stress response, and there's loads of things going on in the background there. There's a kind of cortisol release, there's the adrenaline. There's also some other neuropeptides being released and other hormones that are in play there that are going to dictate at a physiological level how we respond to that environment and that situation. That's an acute stress response. What should happen after that stress has passed is that meter comes back down. So we have the stress response, we respond, and then once it's passed, once those demands have been dealt with, that meter comes back down and we get back into a kind of homeostatic or a resting state. But what happens when we're in very demanding environments for long periods of time is that meter keeps getting hit and it doesn't quite come back down. So this is when we start talking about chronic stress potentially. So, it starts to build and build and build. So you keep getting the hammer hit, it never quite returns back to a kind of relaxed and resting state. And so we have this interaction of these kind of stress responses, this acute stress with the chronic underlying stress. And that impacts on potentially impacts on our function. So when we start to join this story up and we're starting to think about, okay, so we've got these extreme environments, we put people in them. Those people, to varying degrees, will experience some kind of stress. And that stress that they're experiencing will influence their ability to do the things that they need to be able to do in that situation and setting. And this is just an illustration from one of the projects we've been doing recently in the military, where we've been specifying, okay, what functional markers are important to us? We're interested in judgment and decision making. So can people interpret and make good decisions? Are they able to attend and concentrate on the right things? Are they able to do the skilled motor performances they need to do? Can they handle a radio? Can they use a weapon? Are they able to behaviorally keep going and persist under pressure? Do they have the ability to regulate their emotions, their feelings, and their mood? And how able are they to interpersonally interact with others? So can they communicate and cooperate and coordinate effectively? So for us in this work, they're our functional markers. They're the things that we're looking at. So how is stress impacting on those? And what's all the other stuff that influences that effect? For your worlds, in expedition settings, in the hospital, there might be other functional markers that are important to you, other things that are really important from a ability to perform and stay healthy perspective. So this isn't a kind of an exhaustive list. And actually, if you looked at different domains and different settings, the competency frameworks that tend to mark out some of those environments are instructive. So they give a kind of handrail to which you can understand what good function looks like. So this is a competency matrix by an academic called Elaine Poulikos. So this is based on work with the US Special Forces populations, and it looks at the sort of non-technical human behavior competencies that those populations should be able to do. There'll be competency frameworks that guide what you should be able to do as a surgeon or in a hospital in another role. The European Space Agency and NASA have the ISS, so the International Space Station Human Behavior and Performance Competency Model, same sort of stuff. But they're all the kind of functional things that people should be able to do that are potentially influenced by the demands experienced in extreme environments. Now, I kind of highlight this because what we're really interested in when we start to study people that go out into the field is how does the interaction of different demands influence the ability to perform, influence their function on some of those markers that we're interested in? And this is just an example of how we start to kind of lay that out. Now, you can squeeze and add more of these acute stress experiences, or you can elongate it and add, you can make them less frequent. But what we're saying is that this is an example of an expedition, across an expedition period, the people that are taking part in that expedition are going to be experiencing some chronic demands. So the example here is, stuck in a tent, uncomfortable conditions, drifting sea ice, you're not getting much sleep, they're kind of with you all the time. And then in between those, they'll be interspersed with acute periods of stress. So someone falling in between an ice floe, maybe a polar bear coming along and has to be scared off. So they're going to activate an acute stress response. Now, early on in an expedition, when you've not been exposed to those chronic demands, that acute stress experience, you're probably going to be fairly equipped to deal with it, especially if you're well trained and prepared and feeling fresh. How that changes over 15, 30, 60 days, will you still be able to perform to the same level as you were at the start of the expedition? And then what happens if two things come along at once, or three things come along at once? So we call that a cluster effect. If we have clusters of stressors starting to raise their head, what's the impact on function? And it won't necessarily just drop off incrementally. It's potentially, in sport, we sometimes talk about this kind of catastrophe model, where if you keep raising the anxiety or the pressure, at some point that drop off isn't just marginal, it is a kind of sudden drop off a cliff. So this is what we're talking about here. If we start layering and loading stress experiences. Now we know the effects. There's plenty of research out there. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that we know that potentially for some people, the demands of extreme environments, expeditions and otherwise, can lead to certain difficulties. So there's plenty of examples of mental health issues becoming more prevalent on expeditions, and sometimes this is quite serious. So in a isolated Arctic research station, if you've got one person that's really struggling, how do you manage that? And that's not just an individual experience, it can be a team experience. And I'm sure people on the call have experienced conflict in teams that they've been part of, but imagine putting that into the pressure cooker of living and working within a space that violates the UN's conventions for prisons. You keep them up in this sort of small area, and they have to live and work together for long periods of time. What impact is that going to have on conflict and what that looks like in extreme environments? So we know that there are things that happen that are maybe less adaptive from a functional point of view, but equally, we also know, and this kind of harks back to what I was saying at the beginning, is that there's also lots of good stuff. And so we sometimes talk about salutogenic effects. What I've talked about in the previous slides, we'd probably refer to as a pathogenic effect. These extreme environments lead to some kind of dysfunction. But what we often hear is that people going to these places actually thrive. They get meaning out of it. They feel satisfaction for achieving and doing something quite difficult. So we have these kind of competing experiences. And people might have both. You could experience conflict within a team, but then be satisfied from achieving an expedition objective or a successful operational deployment or whatever it is. So why psychology? So from my perspective, what's the point of psychologists being interested in this stuff? Well, psychological research in these domains can help with risk assessment and mitigation, for one. So we can help specify what demands might be encountered by people in these settings, and then we can do things to help mitigate it. We can do research that helps prepare people to go and to cope with those environments. There's things we can do to help people in situ, so we can develop tools to allow people to track and monitor things and maybe take corrective action before it gets too bad. We can support people when they come back. And then from a sort of fundamentals perspective, we can try and develop and progress theory that is relevant to these people in these contexts. So, contextually situated theory development is quite important, at least from an academic scientific perspective. Now, our interest, I say our because all of the research that I've been doing has been collaborative with various colleagues. We're very good colleagues. We're interested in variability. So we want to understand who the people that are doing well and the people that are struggling, like what is it that differentiates those people, both before they go. So can we spot things that might influence what they're going to be like when they go on expedition before they even depart, or on a deployment before they depart? What's happening in environment? So how are the dynamics that are occurring in environment influencing those experiences of function? And then what happens when people come back? How does that look when they transition, reintegrate, maybe never go on an expedition again, or maybe have to cycle up and deploy somewhere else within a few weeks, potentially. And then we use that information, ideally we use that information to design interventions and countermeasures that are aimed at optimizing some of those things, with the intent to evaluate and produce some kind of scientific insight from that. This is just illustrating that we're interested in all phases, and those phases will interact. Now, I'm just I've a bit of a smorgasbord of got smorgasbord in, that's good. Bit of a mixed bag of research. It's quite hard to I'm used to giving academic talks where we focus on a specific research paper, and we present the findings of a study, but we've done lots of studies over the years, and I wanted, because it's a mixed audience, I wanted to just give you a bit of a flavor of all different sorts of stuff that we've been doing. So forgive the maybe tangential direction that some of this goes in, but I'm just going to give you a bit of a sort of running commentary of different studies. So a few years ago, we did some work looking at what we call personal values. So the motivational values that maybe drive people to choose to go and do things in extreme environments. And a lot of this was framed around, how can we look at these people on Earth doing these extreme things to try and understand what sort of motivational factors will be important for picking people for a future Mars mission. So we were interested in these kind of universal personal values. So there's sort of 10 personal values that have been studied across cultures and contexts, hundreds of countries, or 100 plus countries, and hundreds of thousands of people, that have been shown to be valid in these different areas. So these are the 10 things we were looking at. We studied them. Initially, we recruited 4 different populations. So we were looking at high altitude mountaineers. We were looking at Danish special forces population, so Sirius patrol guys who go up to Greenland and spend 12 months up there, still going out with the dogs on sleds and living out in the field. Scientists down at the Concordia station in Antarctica, and then people participating in Mars space simulation studies. So these are the kind of crazy people that sign up to being locked up in a tin can for 15 months and being studied for the purposes of science. And we were interested in, do these people, the question is, do these people have similar values? Even though the context is different, they're all doing things that are sort of slightly demanding in isolated, confined and extreme environments. And the answer is yes. So we saw, if you look at the things in the kind of positive direction on the axis, things like self-direction values, universalism, benevolence, and stimulation were all things that people rated as quite high important values. And those things, so self-direction is about being autonomous, being responsible for making your own decisions, having agency. Universalism is about making a positive contribution to society. Benevolence is about caring about the people that you're in close contact with. And then stimulation is about having new experiences. So those kind of make sense. But what was really interesting is that power was low in all of the hierarchies. So the importance of being in charge, having social status, prestige, influence over others was less important to these people, as was things like tradition. What we saw a sort of discrimination for the groups that were more active. So the mountaineers and the soldiers reported valuing hedonism or enjoyment more, so having enjoyable, kind of immediately gratifying experiences than the other groups. So there's a little bit of differentiation. But then we replicated this. So we were looking at this on the ISS as well. So we recruited, over a number of years, we recruited astronauts and cosmonauts on the ISS, and we tracked them across 6-month missions. So we have kind of 8 time points. 1 is before mission, 8 is after mission, and then there's a kind of monthly assessment. And it's the same story here. So for these people, benevolence was quite high in the hierarchies, universalism, self-direction, tradition was quite high for these groups. But we see a change over time. So if we actually isolated some of these values out, so benevolence declines over a mission, and the importance of power increases over the mission, the kind of significant trends to change. That tells you something about what's happening in those small groups of people. People are becoming less team-minded and more self-focused, which if you kind of reflect a little bit on what that might mean, it might have implications for how the team might function in those situations and settings. We also know that when there are wide differences in the values of team members, so if the person on the top of this list that I can see has high benevolence value, so they really, it's important to them to really care and be concerned about the welfare of people that they're in close contact with, but then the other person that's next to them has a low priority on that value, the bigger that difference, the more likely it is that that's going to contribute to tension. And we see that for almost all of these values when we study it. The bigger the difference in the value priority between team members, the more likely it is that it's going to contribute to tension. And we know that in other studies, when that's happened, when you've had teams that are made up of people with really opposing values, that can contribute to the team breaking down and leading to difficulties, conflict, and the potential failure of expeditions or missions. So we're interested in values. That's one of the kind of indicators of motivation for us that gives us an insight into who we might be looking at when we've got people that we're either selecting, or if we're trying to assess and understand who we've got. If we can't make those selection decisions and we've been given a team, starting to get a bit of a feel for what their values are in that team is quite a useful thing to go through. When people go out to isolated, confined, extreme places, things change. I mean, we've seen that with values, like the values change over time because things in these environments are dynamic. But we've also seen this in the sense of other aspects of how people function. So for this study, we were looking at people spending a winter season at Concordia Station. And we were looking specifically at their coping behavior, so how they actually coped across the confinement in Concordia. And what we saw here was a very interesting pattern for all the different types of coping strategies. They all kind of dropped off into the winter period. So we called this, I mean, we used the term psychological hibernation. It was a sense that people were preserving, or they were conserving their resources, because coping with this demanding period in Concordia was uncontrollable. There was nothing really that they could do to deal with that during the winter period where they were stuck inside. So once they'd adapted to the environment, there was a sort of apathy. And when we talked and we interviewed and we chatted with people that had been in that situation, they said, yeah, people became a bit slower. There was less inclination to want to be around each other for a long period of time. So there's this sort of maybe a protective mechanism. And in the psychology literature, we call that conservation of resources. So there's a whole theory called conservation of resources theory that talks exactly about this dynamic or this phenomenon. So again, for us, it's an interesting insight into the dynamism of people when they're in these environments. The question always for us is, if you're doing monthly assessments of people when they're going on these kind of trips or these kind of deployments, is that enough? Do we get enough insight into what's happening by looking at things on a month-by-month basis? But from my perspective, actually, we miss quite a lot. If we're not getting the granular, like what's happening day to day, we're missing quite a lot. And the reason I say that is that if within a month something really difficult happens and you're waiting another month, especially from a monitoring perspective, you're waiting another month to get your next assessment, there's a lot can happen in 30 days, there's a lot can happen in one day. So we were interested in what do these dynamics look like on a day-to-day basis in this study. And so this was a really interesting project. This was a group of there was a full-time member of the armed forces leading the expedition, and there was a bunch of reserve guys skiing across Antarctica. So they were trying to ski through the pole, coast to coast. And we tracked them. So each team member kept a diary And we tracked them. We were looking at kind of positive and negative emotions, so affect, and kind of events that they were encountering and coping strategies. And what we see on a daily basis is, fluctuation in functioning, but particularly at this period at the South Pole. Obviously for us here, there's something was happening. When we got this data, we look back retrospectively and we're like, wow, that stands out as a period where something is going on. What actually happened there was one team member, and this started a bit earlier on the ski into the South Pole. Team member got injured, became slightly unwell, struggled a little bit, and that decline continued. And then at the South Pole, the team leader had to make a decision to stop that person from skiing off into the second part of the expedition. So it was a difficult time for the team. But what you can see is that they kind of rebounded after leaving, and the team level affect improved from the kind of South Pole point. So we see this dynamic process, and this is in a kind of emotional indicator of emotional experience, but I think it's quite interesting. And we see the same thing if we looked at the coping behavior. There's we anchor it off the what's happening before and after the South Pole in this case. There's a very significant change in what people are doing to cope before and after, and that's influenced by who's in the team, what's happening in the context. Is influencing how they're coping. So on that earlier slide, when I showed you those functional markers, there's a temptation to think about those things in isolation, but what we're increasingly kind of concerned with is how those things interact. And a good colleague of mine, Gro, wrote a paper quite some time ago now, talking about a network of function, so a model of adaptation to isolated, confined, and extreme environments. And they made the case that someone's emotional experience is not separate from their cognitive function. If you are incredibly anxious, and I mean, this is not new in psychology, but if you're incredibly anxious, that's going to influence how you think and how you process things, how you make good decisions or not. That's then going to be interacting with the dynamics in the group. If things are a bit frictiony in there, that's probably going to be causing some other issues that may have an influence then. So these things interact in a dynamic way. So it's not that useful to study them in situ, in isolation, necessarily. Now there are cases where that's appropriate, but we're interested in kind of the network of function in these dynamics, and that's what we've been doing in recent studies. We've been trying to understand how some of these factors interact. So we've just submitted some work based on studying a number of Arctic ski expeditions, so people skiing across Greenland, Svalbard, Iceland, and we collected similar sort of markers. So in this study, similar to the previous polar study, we collected data on affect, but we also collected stuff on team cohesion, self-reported performance, and physical markers of health. And you can see those things are dynamic; they fluctuate over time, as you'd expect. But what's more interesting, and I'm not expecting you to interpret this, by the way, this is more for my benefit. What I think is more interesting, and I'll just sort of say what this shows us, is that if we think about that network model that I just showed you on the previous slide, this data supports that. So, positive affect is correlated with cohesion correlated with performance, positive affects correlated with performance, and physical health is influenced by those things as well. So there's this network of function happening where if you influence one thing, you're probably going to have an influence on something else. So we're starting to see this nice, I guess, suite of measures that tell us, usefully tell us something about how people are operating in these environments under pressure, and give us a place where if we're targeting one thing, we can be relatively confident that if we impact that in a positive way, that might have an effect on something else as well. I mean, that's the hallmark of CBT and different types of therapies that have been around for a long time. But it's nice to see this playing out in field data collected from people when they're doing these things in extreme environments. This is the sort of protocol we've been using in the past. So we give people a logbook, they take it out, they fill stuff out. They're sat in the tent at the end of the day, and they've got a few things to do, and then they lie in a sleeping bag and they're filling our research diaries out. And and they look something like this. That we've kind of had various forms over the years. This was one of the early studies actually that we did with an all-female team to the North Pole, where we were testing this new logbook. But these logbooks, they had these lists here. So they had lists of different types of events and different types of strategies for dealing with things. And in particular, in this earlier work, colleagues and I were very interested in what type of events were occurring, like how frequent were certain events and how did they cluster together. Because that's really interesting. If you think about if something happens, what else is happening at the same time? Or like how probable is it that if you've got a problem with a teammate, these other things might also be going on? Because that helps us then think about how we might manage and mitigate those things. And what we saw when we collected data from, in the end, it was about 45 people, about 1,000 days of expedition data. When we start to run kind of cluster analysis models, we start to see these things happening. So as you'd expect, when people report good stuff happening, they tend to report other good stuff. So if they're saying on a given day, I felt camaraderie with my teammates, it was relatively likely that on the same day, they would say, yeah, I was satisfied that I could cope and I was enjoying the environment. And so there's other good stuff happening. But on a given day, if they reported problems with a teammate, tension with a teammate, at the same time on that given day, they were probably going to be reporting gear problems or concerns over safety or worries about friends and family. So we're starting to see these clusters. And this was at the time very descriptive. We were predicting onto outcomes, so functional outcomes like emotion or affect, but it was very descriptive. It was really just trying to describe the experience of what was going on. At that point, we were kind of interested in stepping back a little bit and starting to apply some theory. So trying to go back to the sort of broader psychology literature and going, okay, how do we explain, why should those things predict those outcomes and why should the things at the bottom predict the negative outcomes? And the theory that was appealing for us was something called self-determination theory, or within self-determination theory, a theory called basic psychological needs theory. And the idea within basic psychological needs theory was that there are three factors that tend to predict either good or bad function in different situations and settings. So if people feel a sense of autonomy, they feel in control, they feel agentic, they feel connected and related to people, and they feel confident and competent, then good stuff tends to fall out of the other side. So we tend to get good responses. So when we go back to this slide and we start to look at, okay, how do those things line up? There's some consistency there. So camaraderie connects to relatedness, progress, competence, coping, feeling like you're in control and can cope, autonomy. Sorry, I've got an eye on my child's baby monitor next to me because it's not been very well all week. So I'm just keeping an eye on. I might have to dash off in a couple of minutes and pop back in 5 minutes, but we'll see how far we go. So we've been using that theory to continue some of this work, but apply a slightly more coherent lens to what we've been doing. So this is a project we've been doing with NASA, where we're actually looking at how those basic needs, so the autonomy, relatedness, and competence needs, predict, again, daily function in expedition environments. So another cohort study of kind of, I think in total about 10 expeditions, 43 people, several hundred days of data. And the story here is that on a given day, when those basic needs are fulfilled, people report more adaptive health responses. When they're frustrated, it's less adaptive. And that carries over, especially from a performance perspective, into the next day. So satisfaction of basic needs predicts good performance. Good performance on that day then predicts satisfaction of the needs on the following day. So we get this kind of recursive cycle. And we see the same story for team dynamics. So at both an individual level from a health and performance perspective and at a team level, these basic psychological needs seem to be contributing positively to what's going on. So at that point, we started to do quite a few of these studies using the basic needs framework. That's just an example of one. We were thinking about how do we then operationalize that into a tool that could be used by people that are off out in the field, We know that, or we seemingly know that those basic needs are important. Can we help people monitor and manage those need experiences and take steps to optimize it? And that's what we've been doing with this drift project for a few years now. So this is an example of a study we did. We gave these two Danish architects that went out to Greenland. They lived in this little habitat that they 3D printed for about 60 days. And let me get to the next slide. So we were using the mobile app off grid, no Wi-Fi, no network. We were able to track their need experiences. So the two people, we were able to kind of track and follow how they were doing, and within their drive certain insights to them to try and optimize their function. And just to illustrate, even at this individual level, so the values on the left of the bracket is person 1, and on the right of the dash is person 2. We're seeing very consistent patterns where these needs are predicting or correlating with good functional outcome markers. So there's some promise here in terms of really getting us to specify, like, what should we be paying attention to try and optimize the function of people in these settings. I'm just going to dash off for 5 minutes, just take a little break, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes, Ellen. I just need to go and sort him out. But
yeah, of course, no problem.
2 minutes. It's a good place to break.
If anyone's got any questions, please do put them in the chat. Or if you have any questions about the society, I'll put the link in as well if you want to join our mailing list and get the updates for the next webinars. All yours.
So, I mean, that was quite a good place to stop. So we've been doing this stuff. A lot of what we've been doing and continue to do actually is looking at people in situ, in as close to kind of real time or in granular terms as possible. So daily or multiple times a day, monitoring what they're doing. Using different tools and techniques. So originally it was using kind of research diaries that we'd produced, paper things. Now it's using mobile apps, so the Drift app, and there's a new app that's on the horizon that will be released hopefully next year at some point to enable that kind of research and intervention. But I thought I'd just talk about a couple of other projects. So we've been doing this work looking at, so we had this idea of, we can go and ask people to give us data when they go to expedition or extreme environments, but there's a lot of history that exists. So when we speak to people about how do you learn how to manage the demands of going to these places, we read books, we look at all the archive data that's existing, and we were thinking, how do we actually exploit that from a psychology perspective? So we've been doing a couple of things. We've been developing a code book that allows us to take old records and see if we can mine them for human behavior insights. So we've done a pilot project with ESA, looking at, or the European Space Agency, looking at Shackleton and Scott's diaries, where we produced a coding dictionary, essentially. So a booklet that has a coding scheme that says if this topic or this thing comes up, it gets this code. And we use that to produce a coded manuscript. And then we try to sequence like what happens between codes, like how do those codes transition from one place to another. And this was just an extract from a specific event in one of the diaries, where everything in a box is something that was coded. And when the lines are thicker, that means that code tends to transition to that outcome or that next code more often. So things like condition worsening transitions to increased danger. So we start to produce these kind of behavior sequence trees where we can start to make transition kind of predictions of like what might happen next and what's the likelihood of that occurring, which I think is really interesting. You know, from an academic methodology perspective, it's really interesting, but from you can imagine an analyst nowadays being able to observe what's happening and be able to code things in real time, and it might be quite useful to be able to make a prediction about what might happen next. So you can see the potential practicalities of that. We've also been doing work on linguistics, so paying attention to what people are saying and how they're saying things is a good indicator of the emotional world of that person. So I published a pilot project a few years ago, looking at a guy that skied across Greenland and trying to see whether self-reported emotions matched up with what we could extract from their language using a video diary. And we've since, so we've been doing this, we've used a couple of different cohorts of people. So we collected all the video diaries or the voice blogs that people have been keeping when they did solo Antarctic trips. And we've been using the program to linguistically analyze that stuff. And much like the fluctuations in self-reported data you saw on a couple of slides ago, and we see the same thing in the linguistic voice notes. But what's really interesting in a recent study, when we looked at these kind of using these linguistic markers against the diary or self-reported data across a bigger sample of people, is that we see quite a decent correlation. So when we ask people to report about their positive emotions, and then we try and correlate those scores with linguistic accounts of what's been happening, so how they're feeling about the day, the positive scores correlate and the negative scores correlate quite well. So this is quite an interesting concept if you're a team leader on an expedition and you're paying attention to what people are saying, are there things you can be attending to and picking up from those conversations that might tell you about their emotional world, like how they're doing, how they're coping, and how they're feeling? Intuitively you would say yes, but it's nice to have something to stand behind on that. So just very quickly, I'll just talk a bit about transitions, like the coming home. So we are interested in this kind of post-expedition experience. We did a bit of work on this a few years ago, where we interviewed quite a lot of people that had been away on varying degrees of expedition. Some had done lots of trips, some had just been and done their first expedition somewhere. And what we see when we analyze the themes from these interviews, these accounts, and we've spoken to quite a few people about this, and we get this sort of agreement, that at an individual level, when people come back, they talk about going from something quite simple, even if it's quite a dangerous or a difficult situation people have been in, to then having to come back and navigate lots of complexity that may be less meaningful to people. So they've gone from a very goal-directed, simple existence to a very complex and not very purposeful environment. It can feel unreal quite quickly. So you've been out perhaps in a big wilderness area and seeing things that not many people have ever seen, and then you come back and it can feel like it was something you read in a book. Reliving the expedition, going back over what you were doing, missing it, and lacking the purpose that might come from doing these really important things that are goal-directed and driven. There's also a social aspect so there's an individual aspect, there's a social aspect of coming back. So you come back to people that maybe haven't been on those things or done those things, and they're still the same, yet you might have changed quite a bit. They might not understand it properly. I remember one of the quotes I really remember from these interviews was someone saying, I've just skied to the South Pole and I came back to a dinner party and I was telling the guests and the other people about it. And their response was, oh yeah, I like to go skiing in France. And they're not exactly equivalent. So there's this sort of lack of understanding. More people complications. So we talked about conflict in expedition teams, but actually those teams often gel and they're working towards a shared goal. So there's more clarity around that than coming back and having to interact with lots of people. The cohesion quickly disappears when you leave that setting with those people that you've had a shared experience with. And then others might only want to hear about your expedition story once before they start losing interest. So there's a superficial interest. So we start to see these, this paints quite a negative picture of the transition experience, but this was based on what people had told us about the coming home. And we know that that initial few weeks can be difficult for people. So we were interested then, could we use some of what we'd learned from our studies of people in these settings to predict what that transition might be like? And we went back to basic needs. And essentially what we found was, if we look at the middle bit of the model, when people, so this is on the expedition, so the middle bit is my needs were either supported or thwarted on the expedition. And then these bits on the end are the after bit, so coming home. So I was more moody and I was more tired. So what we saw was that when people had a very good expedition, so their autonomy, their relatedness, their competence was satisfied, when they came home, they felt more tired and they felt more grumpy. Equally, when those things were really thwarted on the expedition, so if they had a really bad time, they came home feeling more grumpy and more tired. So having a really good expedition experience and having a really bad expedition experience can lead to similar kind of transition experiences. Importantly, if you come back to an environment, and in particular, if you come back to an environment, so this is after, so this is needs thwarting when you get home from an expedition. If you come back to an environment that's really thwarting, so you've been away, you've been doing something that's really motivating, you've had lots of chance to be yourself, and you come back and you've got people that are blocking you feeling like you're in control, stopping you feeling connected to people, stopping you feeling very good at stuff, that can be quite damaging from a transitional perspective. So that environment you come back into is crucial for that adjustment back to sort of reintegrate and readjust to the new environment. So that's just a flavour of some of this transitional work that we've been interested in. Just got a couple of slides left. So I guess the so what bit is like, how do we use that information? So we've been doing a few things. So I don't know why, but for some reason, the European Space Agency asked me a couple of years ago to chair a group on specifying like what we might need to do to solve some of the challenges to send humans back to the moon and then to Mars eventually. And we used a lot of this research, not just mine, but all the research to produce these roadmaps. So the roadmap that I worked on was the psychology one. And in there, we use this kind of learnings to identify gaps in the literature and things that we need to answer to be able to prepare people psychologically to go on space missions. So that's one way that we can use this sort of information. We can use it to roadmap and identify open questions for future research. The other thing we can do is start to try and solve problems. So one of the things we've been doing is we've been doing research on specifying and identifying like practical solutions to help people actually enhance their function in advance of going on expeditions or on extreme deployments. So teaching them how to prepare for things, what sort of strategies they might use to cope with the demands they might encounter. And there's various ways we've done that. This is just an example of a logbook an educational logbook that helps people self-reflect, so they can, they're given things to think about when they're going through difficult situations. And it's designed to help them build a bit of a toolbox for coping with some of those things. In one of the pieces of work we've been doing, it's actually a very joined up project, so an MOD funded bit of work. We've been looking at, and this is the first of numerous studies actually, we've got a few papers under review at the moment, looking at how to support the resilient performance of people in kind of high risk defence and security settings. And through that work, what's come out of the other side is a few different types of products. So we have, there's a program of work that I've been doing called the ARC, which is designed to support people in kind of security environments operate effectively. We have the ARENA program, which is focused specifically on the military, and then some stuff that we do on teams. So this team set, there's a mindset program and a team set program that's designed to get teams functioning effectively, all using different tools and techniques, face-to-face interactions, online material, little interactive guides and stuff like that. that draws on a lot of the research that I've just talked about. And then there's a few other things. So there's a newsletter that I started a couple of years ago, which has been a bit slow to get going, but is going to kick off again this year. So Augmenting Humans, which will be a bit of a showcase of some work that I find interesting. And then a shout out maybe to, I know a few of you have probably read this already, but a really good colleague of mine, Emma Barrett, wrote a book with a guy called Paul Martin called Extreme, why some people thrive at the limits, and deals much more eloquently than I just have with a lot of the psychological stuff related to people performing in these environments. And if there's also this In Extremis program that I did a couple of years ago, which is a self-directed online course. It's going through a bit of a revamp at the moment, but it gives you, I guess, sort of like 30-minute, 1 hour long modules. I think there's about 6 or 8 modules off the top of my head that take you through everything from kind of stress and team dynamics, transition and reintegration and recovery. So there's potentially some stuff there that might be interesting too. That is it. Thanks for bearing with me and for not disappearing. Not too many of you disappearing anyway when I had to duck out for a few minutes. I'll stop the slides there. I'm very happy to answer a few questions if people haven't got to dash off. I know that was a bit of a kind of a mishmash of stuff and probably not that coherent. It's quite late, so.
No, that was great. I'll just pause.